Welcome to Hyde Park. Well, tonight we discuss the controversy surrounding glyphosate. Glyphosate, a herbicide which has been a controversial topic in Sri Lanka over the past few weeks, months and years, is yet cause for question in terms of plantation industry and human health. And tonight we discuss the matter with a personality, with a professor who has been doing years of research into the impact of glyphosate in human health. May I warmly welcome Professor Sarath Gunatilake to our studios at Hyde Park.
Thank you, Indivari.
Well, Professor Sarath Gunatilake needs no introduction, yet let me remind you that he has been doing years of experience, years of research rather, into glyphosate and human health. And 32 years of his career has been spent with the California State University, Long Beach, and he's also residency trained and American board certified occupational medicine physician. Professor Gunatilake, I think you've spent most of your career there in the United States since 1979. Yet your work covers a lot of issues that impact Sri Lanka, that affect our lives here in Sri Lanka, where you are from.
That's right, Indivari. That's because although I live in United States, I keep on coming back to Sri Lanka year after year. And almost yearly I am here, or in some years I have been here twice, or there are a few instances where I have come back thrice a year. So that's partly because I train a lot of physicians here. I have trained over a dozen or maybe 2 dozen of physicians in Sri Lanka, and I conduct exams for the Postgraduate Institute of Medicine in Community Medicine, and I work with these trainees. I work with a lot of issues related to occupational medicine and even other areas of health.
Right. And Professor Gunatilake, glyphosate and human health. Now, this is something you've been doing extensive research, as I mentioned earlier, and over the past 10 years, your focus has been on this. But how do you get into this?
That's an interesting question. As I told you that I have been training so many physicians after their postgraduate training in community medicine, administrative medicine. I get them over to United States. I keep them sometimes in my hospital for almost a year and send them through various training programs. And one of those trainees was Dr. Sujata Senaratne, the wife of the present health minister. She, around 2008, 2009, she invited me to look into this problem of chronic kidney disease. So on her invitation, I came to Sri Lanka and started investigating the problem. That's when I met Dr. Professor Channa Jayasumana, and so we developed a relationship, and I became his supervisor for his PhD thesis, and so the research continued, and I have developed contacts with many other physicians on this issue and continue to be very interested in the problem.
Right. Is it specifically glyphosate and human health, or do you cover, is there a wider spectrum to your research?
Usually my area of specialty within occupational health is the area of pesticides, and I have looked into this problem related to human health and glyphosate, not only in Sri Lanka and in other countries as well. As you know, the same problem exists on the other side of the globe, where countries in Central America like Costa Rica, Nicaragua, El Salvador have the same problem of chronic kidney disease. You see very similar disease in Andhra Pradesh in India, and in the Elmenia Directorate in Egypt. So you can see that this is not just a problem confined to Sri Lanka, but it's a global problem.
Right, but before I go into much talk about glyphosate and what it really is, the herbicide, the impact, I'd like to ask you about your research and whether you're thoroughly convinced that there is a strong link between glyphosate and cancerous or maybe health impact to people surrounding glyphosate usage.
Let's take these issues one by one. You see, the main question that is facing us is how toxic is glyphosate and how does it affect human health? That should be our main question. Now, we can look at kidney disease, we can look at cancer, we can look at other things as branches or as parts of this main issue. In order to answer this question, what we really need to do is, before we even begin the discussion, I would like to clarify what we are talking about. You see, when people talk about glyphosate, they are only talking about the pure compound glyphosate. Now, glyphosate is made of glycine and phosphate. As you know, our human body is 70% water, rest of the 30%, good part of it's made of proteins, and there are certain units that the proteins are made up of, and these units we call them amino acids. And glycine is one of the smallest units of those proteins, and in glycine, when you displace one hydrogen atom with phosphate, you get glycine, phosphate, or glyphosate.
Right.
Now, most of the time, when people talk about glyphosate and say, oh, it's harmless, they are only talking about the pure glyphosate. They refer only to the pure glyphosate. But in reality, it is something else.
Okay.
What we are referring to is Roundup or the pesticide formulations. Now, these formulations...
just to have it clarified again, so glyphosate and glyphosate, weedicide, pesticide are two different
animals.
Okay, that's clarified.
That's right. Glyphosate, in order to make it into a weedicide, let's use the brand name Roundup, because that is the most common brand name that these glyphosate herbicides are marketed under. There are different trade names, but there are actually they say about 700 different trade names now. So the Roundup or the glyphosate herbicide is very different from pure glyphosate. To give you a little analogy, if you put a little drop of pure glyphosate onto a leaf, it is just like putting a drop of water into a lotus leaf. It just slips off. But when you add these formulants into glyphosate, it makes glyphosate stick onto the leaf, and that is what really makes it into a herbicide. So, but the issue here is that when people talk about glyphosate, they are only talking about pure glyphosate. But really the herbicides contain a lot of other additional chemicals, or what we call adjuvants, that are now shown to be about 1,000 times more toxic or injurious to the human body than the pure glyphosate.
Right. Is this through direct application to plantations, or, I mean, how does it work? Enlighten us.
Okay, I think I will explain this. Most other herbicides, when you apply it to a weed, what will happen is that the herbicide gets absorbed through the roots, go up the stem to the leaves, and the whole plant dies. Glyphosate works the other way. Glyphosate is usually sprayed onto the leaves. That's why I said you need those adjuvants, additional chemicals to make it stick onto the leaf. And then from the leaf, it gets down the branches, the stem, and it goes into the roots, and then it gets into the soil and contaminates the water supply and the aquatic animals, that include the fish.
So does that mean that the targeted area is not the only area that will be affected?
Exactly. So I will show you later that when you spray glyphosate on a plant, it is not only that plant that is affected. It affects the soil, it affects the surrounding area, it affects the water supply, it affects the people who spray it.
Right. Professor Sarath Gunatilake, I think you've very simply informed and explained to us the difference between glyphosate and the glyphosate weedicide. So that's understood. But you were talking about its application and the impact on human health and the environment.
Right. To explain that, I think the best way to do this is to take you through the history of glyphosate. Glyphosate was first discovered in United States. When the chemical was discovered, they didn't have any use for it. The first use they had was to remove the deposits inside the water pipes. You know, these calcium, magnesium, all these salts get deposited in the pipes, and they clog the pipes. Glyphosate was used to clean up those pipes, because glyphosate has a property of binding on to those calcium and magnesium and all these metallic deposits, making it soluble so that you can just wash it out, and that's how it was first discovered. Then Monsanto bought glyphosate and brought it forward to the market as a herbicide. This was in the 1970s. Now, in about 10, 15 years, 20 years, glyphosate became the best and the most popular pesticide that was used in the whole world. Now, to do this, Monsanto used two main strategies. One is they developed what we call genetically modified crops. Genetically modified crops are those crops where you take a gene from, let's stick to the example of the plants. You take a gene from another plant or a bacteria and introduce into this new plant. When you do that, what happens is that you completely change the characteristics of that plant. In fact, this was discovered, this was thought of as one of the greatest discoveries in food science, and the FAO, or the Food and Agriculture Organization, presented the Monsanto scientists who discovered this biotechnology or gene transfer as for they awarded him with the World Food Prize. The World Food Prize is something akin to the Nobel Prize in medicine. They thought that this technology will help to eliminate world hunger by creating plants that are resistant to weeds, that are resistant to insects, that are resistant to various extremes of the climate. But that never happened. What Monsanto did instead was to develop genetically modified crops that are resistant to glyphosate. What happened then was that the crops they developed, like corn, wheat, soybean, these crops like sugar beet, these were resistant to glyphosate. So you can grow them on mass scale and spray glyphosate aerially through helicopters. The plants, because they have been genetically modified, will not be affected by glyphosate, and all the weeds will die. This way, very large amounts of glyphosate was used in United States and all over the world. Parallel to this, the Monsanto company also used a very effective advertising campaign that was not completely true. What they said was glyphosate was safer than table salt. And they said that you can spray it anywhere around children, in schools, parks, without much concern, because when it gets into the ground, it doesn't last long, it breaks into its component, glycine, phosphate, so it's really harmless. That was not true. So anyway, with these two strategies, what they did was the glyphosate market went up 9-10 times or even more, and the whole world started using glyphosate. They were aerially spraying glyphosate in corn, wheat, and various other genetically modified plants.
If you talk about the how was the impact of glyphosate really found now, when people were so convinced that this was a real solution to food safety world over?
So this was used so widely that the glyphosate use went up 10-15 times, as I told you. So with that, things went on until 2015-16, and then glyphosate began to appear in human food. This happened in United States. They discovered glyphosate in Ben & Jerry ice cream. In US, Ben & Jerry ice creams is one of the very famous, well-known ice cream brands. When glyphosate was discovered in Ben & Jerry ice cream, Ben & Jerry company issued a statement. They said, yes, you found a little bit of glyphosate in our ice cream, but what about the other foods? They let the cat out of the bag and said, you get 78 times more of glyphosate in wheat bread. You get 680 plus times of glyphosate in Cheerios. So people began to get concerned because they saw that glyphosate, the foods that were made with this massive scale spraying of glyphosate contains glyphosate, and people who consume that food have accumulated, we call that bioaccumulation, accumulated glyphosate in their body.
And this process over the years creates harmful impact.
Yes, we'll come to that in a minute. And they also found, they did serial studies and found that the excretion of glyphosate in urine in American people increased by over 15 times over this period where glyphosate spraying has increased. So now we have evidence that it accumulates in food, that people who consume glyphosate accumulates that glyphosate in their body, concentrates it, and it appears in urine. Okay?
Yes.
Now, the same thing happened in Europe. Let's discuss that.
Yeah.
So, same thing happened in Europe, and they discovered two things. This is very recent, 2015, 2016, 2017. They discovered, they analyzed about 417 samples of soil from 11 different countries in Europe.
Right.
And about 45% of those samples contain glyphosate.
Right.
And so the scientists in Europe looked at how glyphosate accumulates in soil. They worked it out. They produced a very simple model. When people spray glyphosate, they inhale it, they absorb it through their skin, they get it through their food, and also it contaminates the soil through soil erosion and other ways. It gets into the waterways, and it's also present in the atmosphere. And they even said the rain sometimes contains a little bit of the glyphosate. So the bioaccumulation was confirmed. At the same time, this happened last year, or I think in 2016, maybe last year. Monsanto applied for a 15-year extension of the glyphosate license in the European Union. And there was a big debate in European Union, because by that time people found that it is accumulating in their food, and they were discussing the toxic effects of human health
of glyphosate, on human health.
And so the debate went on. About 1 million people signed the petition. They marched to the European Union Parliament and handed over the petition. And when the MPs, the members of the Parliament of the European Union, were discussing this matter, there was a heated discussion, like you said. It's not only in this country, it happened in Europe, it happens in the US, it happens in everywhere where glyphosate is being used. So when this matter was being discussed in the European Parliament, the British Green Party, one of the MPs suggested, you are debating about it, why don't we test our urine and see whether we have glyphosate in our urine?
So they did so.
So now this became a famous test. They said MP stands for members of Parliament, MP P. P refers to urine. So they did the MPP test, and lo and behold, they found the urine test was positive in every MP that they tested. So the European Parliament members were convinced that we are taking in glyphosate and accumulating in our body and excreting it. So to cut a long story short, the application of glyphosate for 15-year approval was shortened to 5 years, with lot of protests, lot of influence from Germany, where the Bayer company was going to buy Monsanto, and so they shortened it and said, we need to look into this problem more, and we need to evaluate it further.
Right. I think going forward from there, let's talk about the European and American scenario, and what solution they went into, and how Sri Lanka faced the matter. Since we were talking about the European scenario, Professor, let's talk about in Sri Lanka. What solutions did Europe and America adopt after finding out, after revelations that glyphosate and its toxic impact on human health?
Yeah, let's talk about first the impact on human health. The biggest controversy we have in United States about the health effect of glyphosate is the issue of cancer. Now, in 2015, the cancer research arm of the World Health Organization declared glyphosate as a cancer-causing agent. Of course, Monsanto protested against it, and there were so many other protests going on. But based on this information, today, in the US, there are more than 1,000 lawsuits filed against Monsanto. In California, where I live, there are more than 375 lawsuits filed in San Francisco, California District Court. These cases are being heard now, And as a part of these hearings, Monsanto had to divulge all the internal documents and emails that they used for the evaluation of health effects of glyphosate. Now, when they divulged all these information, it was very clear that they themselves in their emails say, we cannot say that glyphosate is not carcinogenic. We cannot say that it doesn't affect the liver. We cannot say that it doesn't affect affect the kidney. And there is a large amount of research that is going on right now to show that glyphosate, I told you, it's a very simple amino acid. It blocks certain enzymes, and as a result of this blockage, they have now shown that it causes a multiplicity of diseases, not only including kidney disease, not only including some, they say that it makes particular contribution to diabetes, autism, and dementia. Autism is a disorder where children have problems in interacting with their normally with their environment, and dementia where people are losing their memory, and they say that it is due to blockage of certain enzymes by glycine phosphate instead of putting in glycine, that these because of the shortage of these enzymes, they are seeing a multiplicity of diseases appearing and increasing in close parallel to the increase in the usage of glyphosate. Now, I have to be very clear here. I'm not saying that these close correlations does really mean causation, but these correlations are so close that scientists are beginning to look at how could we have such close correlations with the pattern of usage of glyphosate and with these diseases. So that is where the research is now at this point. And so what I am trying to say, here I want to emphasize one very important principle in occupational medicine. We call that the precautionary principle. When you, in Sri Lanka, you know that we had almost 25,000 deaths over the last 25 years of glyphosate usage. Again, the problem here I see is that people were looking for one single cause for that kidney disease. When you take any chronic disease, like for example heart disease, there is a multiplicity of factors that affect that disease. If I tell you that heart disease is caused only by cholesterol, will you believe me? You won't, because you know that there are other factors including genetics, the diet you eat, and high blood pressure, and so many other factors that affect heart disease. Now, chronic kidney disease is the same, but through many of the epidemiology studies that was done in Sri Lanka, in Central America, we have now shown that there is enough to believe
that there is an
that
effect.
Glyphosate has a very big role to play in this, whether it chelates different metals from a contaminated environment, whether it contaminates the water supply or the food supply. And the main factor here again is that through the people who are spraying glyphosate or people who work with glyphosate in the farms, all these factors come into play and they block different enzyme systems in the body, and that has multiple health effects in the body.
What action has been taken to avoid the usage of glyphosate weedicide around the world, probably in the United States?
Yes. Now, in the European Union, I told there was a lot of protest, and there are many different countries who have now decided to limit their use of glyphosate. This is very important because, as you said, there are certain economic impacts. People have got used to the habit of using glyphosate on a mass scale,
Yes.
and you can't suddenly stop it overnight. But these countries, the most important thing is, these countries are beginning to evaluate these health effects of glyphosate and realizing that these health effects are far more important than the economic impact of it, and trying to reduce the use of glyphosate and to find other alternatives for glyphosate. When I say other alternatives, I really don't mean the usage of other pesticides,
Right.
but doing the farming in ways in which you can reduce the use of pesticides and other chemicals that are toxic to the body.
Right, because there were reports that glyphosate ban cost 35 billion rupees in crop losses just during that period for Sri Lanka, in Sri Lanka. But what does it really mean to Sri Lanka going forward, Professor? What options do we have? The ban is lifted, and here we are. We're talking about a risk to life, and chronic kidney disease is impacting farming community in Sri Lanka largely in certain areas, and we see a major impact in human health. Going forward, what should policy direction be?
Right. Again, when you look at the cabinet paper that was put forward, there are certain qualifications here. You're going to use it for the next 3 years and use glyphosate according to the standards. But glyphosate has never been used according to the standards in this country, because I know, I have done the research. If you're really doing it according to the standards, what we really have to do is to analyze different samples of glyphosate that are being brought into this country, look at those additives, look at those adjuvants, look at the impurities in those adjuvants. They have shown that many brands of glyphosate contains impurities like arsenic and cadmium. They can bind arsenic and cadmium from the ground, from the fertilizer and other contaminants, and then we have to, number one, test the glyphosate that's being brought into this country. Number two, we have to test our water supply and food supply to make sure that they don't contaminate our water supply. Number three, if we were to use glyphosate with individuals spraying it, we have to monitor their health. That should be done very carefully. Then we have to monitor the environment to see whether it contaminates the environment. I told you the food supply and other things. And it is especially important for the tea industry. The plants, the weeds are developing resistance to glyphosate. We have to measure that. We have to measure the amount of glyphosate that if we spray it on tea, we will have to label it as such. That will be a biggest drawback on the Ceylon tea industry, which is considered the best tea in the world. And as a Sri Lankan, I am so proud of it. We might destroy that reputation that we have.
Professor Gunatilake, I think since you were talking about how we should take measures to avert risks, to take corrective measures, as per your research so far, do you see that Sri Lanka has taken at least taken a step forward towards mitigating its impact?
Mitigating in the best way is, as I told you, as what other countries are trying to do, is to eliminate the use of these pesticides. I see efforts here and there to grow vegetables, rice and other food with either minimum usage or I would say with completely without these agrochemicals, it can be done. And there are countries which are doing it. And for example, I just saw a study from China where they have in a mass scale have reduced the use of agrochemicals, fertilizer and all this and still increased the production by 50. They reduced the fertilizer use by 15%. Since I mean synthetic fertilizer, and by 11%, and still increase the food production by 15%. So there are ways and means of doing it. There are ways of what we call integrated weed management, where we can reduce the use of these chemicals. And if we use it, please, we do have to monitor it.
Right.
Because these chemicals are toxic to the human body.
Right. And I think, Professor, that's all the time we have on the program, but thank you very much. It has been a very informative session, personally for me too. But before we go, I'd like to ask you what you thought of coming back to Sri Lanka to take up maybe a position to provide your services in terms of, maybe regulating the usage of pesticide in Sri Lankan plantation sector?
Actually, I prefer to continue where I am as it is, because with my current position, I am able to help Sri Lanka. I am able to help Sri Lankan physicians in a big way, and I think I will be satisfied with that. And I am reaching the latter part of my career, and I would like to relax, but still continue as providing as much service in terms of what I know and what I can do to Sri Lanka.
Thank you very much for your time, your service, your research and all your effort to enlighten people with your research work. Professor Sarath Gunatilake, Professor, California State University, Long Beach, also a residency trained and American board certified occupational medicine physician, joining us in our studios. Thank you very much once again.
Thank you.
So we had, I'm sure, an informative and comprehensive discussion about glyphosate and its impact on human health. Have a pleasant evening. We'll see you again next Thursday at 10:30 p.m. on Ada Derana 24/7 at HydePark.